Right, so here we go. So, as I've said, Kings is part of the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Okay. And you will find out that in modern, you will find out that the book, you'll be surprised that the book of Joshua to the book of Kings, they are classified among the prophets. Okay. So why is the book of Kings a prophetic book? Number one, there are reasons for this. Why Kings is placed in the Hebrew Bible among the prophets, because it records deeds and exploits of a large number of prophets. Okay, did you get that? Kings is part of the prophets because it records the story of Nathan, the story of Ahijah. You have also the story of Jehu, Micaiah, and then you have also the story of Isaiah and Huldah right there. Okay, and then of course you have several unnamed prophets, and the most famous of these prophets are Elijah and Elisha in 1 Kings chapter 17 to chapters to 2 Kings chapter 6 to 13. This is the first reason why the book of Kings is part of the prophet. Secondly, the prophetic books, okay, also made use of the history recorded in the book of Kings. It's when the prophetic books used the book of Kings, it's almost verbatim, all right? So you can find that the records from Kings written in Jeremiah chapter 52, you have 2 Kings chapter 34, 18 to 25 to 21, that's Jeremiah and 52, and then you have Isaiah 36 to 39. You can also find that story in 2 Kings 18, 13 to 19. So 20 to 19, 20 verse 19. So you have that. So this is the second reason. The third reason is that the books of Chronicles may have also influenced this classification. And Chronicles would indicate that some of the prophets would also write something about the historical narrative about the reigns of the kings. That's Chronicles, okay? And then you have also the books of Joshua, 2 Kings, Joshua to Kings. It's called Deuteronomic history. You know what's the Deuteronomic history is? Okay, when you talk about Deuteronomic history, you have actually read that many times in the book that we have. It tells us that Joshua to the book of Kings is basically or strongly influenced by the book of Deuteronomy. That is why it's called Deuteronomic history. Right, let me repeat that. The books of Joshua to the book of Kings, it's often called Deuteronomic history because it is strongly influenced by Deuteronomy. So you have the stories of the prophets there, successors of Moses, and then it also continued the story of the people of Israel coming out from the land of Egypt, going to the land of Canaan, and then Joshua and the book of Kings actually continued the story where Deuteronomy ended, okay? And then in the curses, prophetic curses of Moses, it's the realization of all those is seen in the book of Kings, okay? Right, that is why in the Talmud, you'll find out that Jeremiah was would be probably the author of the book of Kings. In Talmud Baba Batra 15 verse 8, 15a, it tells us that Jeremiah is the author of the book of Kings. Of course, we all know that Jeremiah wrote two other books. Jeremiah, the book that is named after him, and then also Lamentations. And the Talmud believed that it was also Jeremiah who wrote the book of Kings. It was because Jeremiah was very active in the active during the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, and you'll take note that the book of Kings talks about, or the end part of the book of Kings tells us about the destruction of Jerusalem. That is why, since Jeremiah was very active during the time when the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, which capital is Jerusalem. Okay, let me repeat that. Jeremiah was very active during the destruction of Jerusalem. And the book of Kings ended with the destruction of Jerusalem. So many believe, the Talmud believe that Jeremiah was actually the author of the book of Kings. All right, so yes, the English name, of course, the English name of the book of Kings comes from the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint placed this book as the third and the fourth reigns. Okay, so the first and the second reigns belong to the book of Samuel. Okay, so you have it down there, and the Septuagint used this as part of the book of the Kings. Okay. All right. So now, originally, they believed that the book of Kings is one book. Okay. So what we have in the English Bible now is First and Second Kings, right? First and Second Kings. But we find, scholars have found out that Kings actually consist of one book instead of just one book. The break in the account of Ahaziah appears very artificial. Okay, so now you have the book of Kings. Basically, it's actually one book. So if we consider that as one book, there is no First Kings and Second Kings, because it should only be titled as Kings, because it's considered as one book. Right, let's look at the historical background of the Kings. The historical background of the Kings tells us the history of Israel, beginning with the transition of power from David to Solomon. All right, so you see here from 931 BC, okay, to it's the record about this transition is found in 1 Kings 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 12. And it actually ended with the release of Jehoiakim from prison during the Babylonian captivity in the year 562 to 561 BC. This was the time when during the third, okay, during the third campaign of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And then you'll find out also that in the book of Kings, there are marked theological themes and vocabulary that are also that characterizes Joshua and Samuel. So these books, Joshua, Samuel, and Kings, are thought to be of a single literary work. So from Joshua, then you have Samuel, and then you have Kings. It's they believe that it is only one book. All right. So there are three major questions asked of this book. Number one is, who produced the book? Was it really Jeremiah? Or was there any editor who wrote the book? And how did it come into existence? Okay. And what was its purpose? So this is the first question here. And then the ancient Greek translations differ significantly from the empty to varying degrees. So you'll find out that the Greek translation is very different from the Masoretic text. So what is the reliable text right now? Now you'll find out that yes, some of the Bibles, English Bibles right now, was actually translated from the Greek translations, okay, instead of using the Masoretic text. And you'll find out, scholars have found out that the Greek translations are very different from the Masoretic text. So which one of these texts is reliable? The Greek translations or the Masoretic text? That's the question. And then number three, the author or compilers of this history obviously had particular interest in chronology. So looking at the chronological notices in the book, you'll find out that there are appear mutually contradictory. Again, so chronological notices are contradictory. So how are we to understand or evaluate the chronological notices? That is why there are some groups today who are saying that there is a discrepancy between the book of Kings and of Chronicles. And since there are discrepancies in the book of Chronicles and the book of Kings, you cannot rely on the authenticity of the Bible. Okay, so this becomes a way of attacking the Bible basically. But how are we to understand or evaluate the chronological notices? So we will try to answer all these questions this afternoon. Okay, now there are the history of composition. First, you have extending the Pentateuchal sources. Again, what are the Pentateuchal sources? The Pentateuchal sources is the traditional source critical analysis of the Pentateuch. So the way how they analyze or they criticize the book of Pentateuch, they also apply it in the book of Kings. All right. So the way how the method of analysis for the Pentateuch, they also use that for the book of Kings. So scholars believe or identify that there are traces of Yahweh's, okay, and Elohist sources through Judges and well into Kings. So there are two sources of the book of Kings. You have the Yahwehist and the Elohist. If you can still remember, the Pentateuch, the critical analysis, they said that the Pentateuch has 4 different sources, the J, D, E, P, okay? The Yahwehist, the Deuteronomist, the Elohist, and the priests. All right, so those are the 4 sources that where the Pentateuch comes from. And so they're also saying that the book of Kings came from these sources also. However, you'll find out that this source critical analysis, this group who use the source critical analysis on the book of Kings, they have divergent conclusions. Okay? They cannot agree together. So because of these different or divergent conclusions, it becomes an undoing in the theory of the Pentateuchal sources, or yes, this critical analysis. Okay, you'll find out also that in the pervasive influence of Deuteronomy in Joshua and Kings was not easily reconciled with the concept of a mere mechanical union of sources that characterize the older sources. So they attempt to uh, eventually put these things together. But what happened here, eventually the source critical analysis, they have abandoned it. So uh, basically, the source critical analysis of the history of composition for the book of Kings did not stand firm. Okay, and then you have the next one here. You have a double reduction. So when we talk about double reduction, that means to say that there are two sources here. Okay, so scholars would believe that the book of Joshua to the book of Kings, they belong to the Deuteronomic history or Deuteronomistic history. When we talk about, again, Deuteronomistic history tells us that that the book of Deuteronomy influenced the book of Kings. So what influence did the book of Deuteronomy carry into the book of Kings? It carries the theology, themes, and some vocabulary that you find in Deuteronomy. It's also used in the book of Kings. All right. Now, these critical scholars of this Deuteronomistic history dated, let me see if I think I didn't put that there, dates the book of Kings during the time of Josiah. If you can still remember what happened to Josiah, when he tried to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem in 621 BC, years before the kingdom of Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon, Josiah found the book of the law right there. And so since the book of the law was found during the time of Josiah, the scholars would say that it was basically written during the time of Josiah. Now, the purpose of this is to make way to legitimate Josiah's centralization of both political and religious power in Jerusalem. All right, so this is the reason why they said that it was during this period of time of Josiah that the book of Kings was written. Okay. Now, another thing here is a later historian who lived during the period of the exile, okay, updated this earlier edition of the book. So take note, Josiah lived before the exile. In other words, yes, I've told you that Josiah found the book of the law prior to the exile, prior to the conquering of Nebuchadnezzar of the city of Jerusalem. So that's the first reduction here. But a later historian would eventually update this edition of the book by, number one, providing the history following Josiah's reform through Jehoiakim's release from prison. Okay, so this later redactor would do a revision. Okay, and this redactor provided the history of Josiah's reform up to Jehoiakim's release from prison. Remember, Jehoiakim was brought to Babylon, and when he was brought to Babylon, Jehoiakim was released from prison, and he was given the highest seat during the time of Evil-Merodach, when Evil-Merodach reigned in the kingdom of Babylon long after King Nebuchadnezzar had died. So this is the work of this later historian. And another one is this later historian added his interpretative concerns to the earlier edition. So when you talk about interpretation, he would explain why why did the people of Israel came into exile or went into exile? Okay, so yes, the second editor compiler provided a theological explanation for why the exile had taken place. So you see here the history of composition of the book of Kings. Double reduction. The first one was during the time of Josiah, and the second one was during the period of the exile. Okay, another theory here is that there is a single historian. Okay, so North, we have heard about his name. North is very famous historical theologian, rejected the idea that there was rejected both Pentateuchal sources. Okay, rejected the DH, or you call that Deuteronomistic history. And he also rejected the idea that there were two different stages in the composition of Kings. So basically, he rejected the Pentateuchal sources. All right, let's go back to that. He rejected the Pentateuchal resources and also the double reduction right there. All right, so yes, so he believed that there was only one one writer or single author who contributed to Deuteronomy 1 to 43. And he would say that this, the author actually compiled or wrote the history of Deuteronomy with the story of Joshua and the kings. And he argued that this is one source, because this historian would actually argue that the history show hope for a return to the land and to divine favor. Okay, however, Mackenzie actually the tendency of theories of reductional analysis to degenerate into increasingly complex reductional layers. So what happens now what happens is that Mackenzie saw that when a person believes, or when a scholar believes that there are series of reduction, so it would mean that there would be different persons who wrote the book of Kings. Okay, so single historian. And another one here is other scholars also envisage a compositional history more complex than either double reduction or single historian. And they believe, okay, they believe that the book of Kings grew within a Deuteronomic school or circle. That is why you have here the Deuteronomic circle. But the problem with this is that instead of answering the question or a definite, or instead of giving a very definite answer to who the author of the book of Kings, it becomes very vague eventually, because when you say this was written by Deuteronomic circle, and of course if you're talking about a circle, there are different persons involved right there, and these different persons are not named. So eventually you will never know who the writer of the book of Kings, because of these Deuteronomic circles. And yes, these Deuteronomic circles included the Levites or some factions of Jerusalem priesthood. Others would say that these are prophets. Others would suggest that these are counselors and wise men of Jerusalem, royal court. Others argue that these are a single social or career group. and so on and so forth. So eventually, this Deuteronomic circle gives us an answer that is not very definite, because they now tend to be they now tend to go away from who the real author of the book of Kings basically. Okay, so all right, so we talk about these 4 history of composition, and I hope you get all those things that we would like to share with you this afternoon in relation to the history of composition. All right. Okay, so we have also the extension of the Pentateuchal sources. Yes, we have the yes, the Pentateuchal sources. We talk about the Yahwehs and the Elohis right there. All right. Oh, sorry. Okay, yes. So you have here the authors or compilers or sources. Okay, so when we talk about sources, of course, it's very clear that the book of Kings have its own sources. Okay, these are examples of the sources where the book of Kings was taken. You have the Annals of the Kings of Judah, 1 Kings 14:29, 15:7, 2 Kings 8:23, 12 verse 19, 14 verse 18, 24 verse 5 tells us that the book of Kings, when it was written, it was not written by someone who basically is an eyewitness. So he had also other sources. So you might ask me whether it's okay to have other sources. Yes, because it's actually okay to have other sources. If you go to the New Testament, you'll find out that the book of Luke was not an eyewitness, but when he wrote about the story of Jesus, he had different sources. And so he came up to his own version of the Gospels. So the book of Kings is just like that. This means to say that before the book of Kings was written, there were already records of what happened, okay, for the kings of Judah. So when the book of Kings was written, the writer or the author took these sources and made his own version for the book of Kings. And another source would be the Annals of the Kings of Israel. Okay, so 1 Kings 14:19, 15:31, 2 Kings 1:18, 10:34, 13 verse 8, and 12. Now take note, what's the difference between